All right, so let's first go ahead and try to understand the problem that we are facing and why do we even require middleware. Now you can see over here that we have an action and it's called fetch movie details. It takes in an IMDb ID, then it uses a web service to make an asynchronous call, a network call, passing in the IMDb ID, and eventually it gets some sort of a result back, either success or the failure. Now what we want to do, if it's a success, we want to dispatch an action and we want to send that action all the way to the reducer, passing in the movies so that these movies can be stored in a global state and other people can use it. Other components or views can utilize it or use it. Unfortunately, with this approach that we're doing, we don't have the capability of dispatching an action. You can see that even though we are going to get the movie successfully, there is no way for this particular action to dispatch another action because it does not really have handle, it does not have access to the dispatch. Now, if we talk about the Redux framework in JavaScript and how does Redux framework in JavaScript handles this kind of a scenario, then we can go ahead and look for Redux Thunk. Redux Thunk in JavaScript is a middleware that will allow you to dispatch from inside the action. So you can see right over here, we are inside the action called increment async, and we have access to the middleware. And since we have access to the dispatch, we can dispatch a particular action. Over here, they're dispatching increment action. But if you read it closely, Redux Thunk is nothing more than a middleware. So what we're trying to do is that once you dispatch an action, that action is going to be dispatched, and then before it reaches a reducer, it is going to be passing with the middleware. When it passes through the middleware can perform this request, not the action, but the middleware. The middleware can get all the data from an API, and then the middleware will be able to dispatch an action later on. So that is the whole point of a middleware. Middleware is some place where you can dispatch an action. So let's go ahead and see that how we can use a middleware to create a very, very simple logging scenario, meaning whenever you perform any action, it's simply going to log on the console that something has been logged. Later on, we are going to see that how we can use a middleware in asynchronous actions, meaning in scenarios where we are making an asynchronous call from a middleware and then we are dispatching an action once we get the data. So let's go ahead and get started with creating a simple middleware for logging. Welcome back, everyone. So now that you understand that what exactly is a middleware and why do we need a middleware, let's go ahead and get started with implementing our first and a very simple middleware. Now this middleware will be responsible for logging the actions, meaning whenever an action is dispatched, we're just going to say middleware is fired, and that's it. And later on, we will go ahead and jump into creating asynchronous middleware, which is going to perform asynchronous requests and get the data and dispatch some action. But starting always simple is a good idea. So I'm going to go ahead and jump into my store. Right now, you can scroll down and you can see the store definition. And our store definition indicates that it takes in a reducer and it takes in a state. But it doesn't really take in any middleware. So we can accommodate that by passing and creating a middleware. Just like a reducer, a middleware is in the end just a function. So let's go ahead and create a definition of the middleware function. I'm going to go ahead and say type alias, middleware. And a middleware is going to act on a particular state. So I'm just going to represent that by a stored state. And we will also create a constraint on it that a stored state has to be using the Redux state. And you can see the Redux state is a protocol, which we have declared earlier on if you have been following the videos. Okay, and the value will be, well, it's going to take in the stored state. That's the first argument. It's going to take in an action. And it's going to go ahead and give you the dispatcher, meaning it's going to give you the new action. So I'm going to go ahead and say over here escaping and dispatcher. Dispatcher is another type alias we're going to create in a moment, and it's going to return you nothing. Now, what does dispatcher actually looks like? A dispatcher is a very simple type alias. It is called dispatcher, and meaning we can take in an action, and again, it's not going to return anything. So middleware is a type alias which acts on a stored state. We are going to make sure that that particular stored state uses or conforms to the Redux state protocol. We're going to be passing in the actual stored state. We're going to be passing in the action, and we are going to be passing in the dispatcher, actually right over here. There we go. And dispatcher is the one that is going to give us the action. So this is our middleware. All right. So now that we have created the definition or the type alias for the middleware, we can actually go ahead and plug it in our store. Right now you can see that our store takes in a reducer and a state. We can go ahead and update that, and we can say middlewares, because it can be a list of middlewares, right? I mean, you can have one middleware which is like logging middleware. You can have a movies middleware. You can have whatever, a TV show middleware or users middleware, task middleware, and so on. So we'll have an array of middleware. It will be middleware, and we're going to pass in the stored state. There we go. Stored state is obviously coming from whenever you are setting up your store. And usually in our case, it will be the app state, which is the global state. We have created the middleware over here, but we haven't really passed it to our initializer. So that's why it's complaining. So let's go ahead and add this to the middlewares. And it's going to be an array of middleware, which will be using stored state. And we will also initialize it to be an empty array. So if you don't pass in middleware, we're just going to initialize it with empty array. And if you do pass it, we're going to go ahead and assign the middlewares to the middlewares. Perfect. All right. Now the question is, when should we fire the middleware? Well, we should fire the middleware after firing our actions. So right after the action has been dispatched and before it reaches the reducer, we should go ahead and fire the middleware. One of the updates that we need to do over here is that since we are setting up the state and state is marked with published, we have to make sure that we are setting the state on the main queue. So dispatch queue, which we didn't do the last time, but we have opportunity to do it right now, and it's a good idea to do it. If you don't do it, then it can produce some weird kind of results, and you also will get some warnings from Xcode that you are trying to set a published property value and not in the main queue, in the global or in the background queue. So you have to make sure that you are setting it on the UI thread or the main queue. Okay, so after dispatching this action, we can actually go ahead and run all middlewares. And we're saying we can run all middlewares because middleware in the end is an array. So we can actually simply just go through each middleware, get individual middleware, which is by the way a function, because middleware is a function, and simply just calling the function. So middleware, and then state, and then action, and then calling in the dispatch function, which is this one right there. All right, let's go ahead and build it. Okay, so this is all set up. This is great. But currently, we don't really have any middleware. So let's go ahead and create a middleware. And we can create middleware anywhere that you want. I'm just going to go ahead and create a new folder over here and we'll call it middlewares. And we can call it logging middleware, log middleware, whatever you want to call it, you can call that. So I'm just going to go ahead over here, add a new Swift file, and I will call it log middleware. This middleware will be very, very small anyways. I mean, it's simply printing out or logging the information. And it's going to be a function, and I will say log middleware, which is a function, and it will return you a middleware with the app state. Okay, so this is what we want to return. So I'm going to go ahead and return, and the middleware app state, if you remember the definition, if we go back, this means that we have to return something which is state, action, and a dispatcher. So let's go ahead and see that how we can return that. So we're going to go ahead and return a state. We're going to return an action, and we are going to go ahead and return a dispatch, which is the most important part. And this is it. So this will be our actual log middleware. And obviously in this, we're not really doing much. So I'm just going to go ahead and say log middleware and simply print out this so that we know that the log middleware is actually getting called, because that's what we are trying to do. Now we have created the middleware, but we haven't really plugged in the middleware anywhere. And that's the most important part, that you plug in the middleware. And that is done when you are setting up your store. So if you jump into your Hello Redux app.swift file or any kind of an app file that you have, we are using Xcode 12, you can see that we are simply passing in the reducer and the state to create the store. The third argument that we just added, the third parameter, is actually a list of middleware. So we can go ahead and pass in a list of middleware. And in that case, I'm just going to be passing in the log middleware because that's the only middleware we have. And that should do it. Now, if you were passing in some multiple middlewares, those middlewares can also get invoked and executed. It can also, based on the type that you want to, type of the action, and the middleware can look at the action and then do some perform some sort of a task, which we're going to cover later on. So don't worry too much about that. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and try to run this application, keeping in mind that the middleware is fired every single time any action takes place. So let's go ahead and run the app, and let's go ahead and increment. And there we go. You can see right here on the console that it is actually firing the log middleware. I'm going to go ahead and decrement. Another one, log middleware is fine. I'm going to say add. Log middleware is getting fired. So you can see that with every single thing that we are trying to do, the log middleware is actually getting invoked. Maybe you want this kind of a middleware, maybe you don't, but this is one of the most simplest kind of middleware, which is showing you that whenever an action is getting dispatched, after the action is dispatched and before it reaches a reducer, we are firing that particular middleware. Now, obviously, in a more practical sense, you may not want to fire a middleware with every single action or the same middleware with every single action. You may want to fire a middleware just to fetch information like movies or something like that. So that is going to take asynchronous request, and we are going to do that in the next lecture. So let's go ahead and check it out, that how we can perform or how we can invoke a middleware when we are performing an asynchronous request. Now, before we jump on to the next video, I do want to talk about Azam Sharp School, which is one of the largest catalogs for iOS development. I mean, check out these courses. If you simply click on the courses, you'll get a list of 22 plus courses. All of these courses are extremely intricately created for you. They all have hands-on exercises. I mean, look at these courses over here. Test-driven development. You have server-driven UI, Swift Data Bootcamp, MV design pattern, full stack iOS development, reactive programming, and much more. Now, you can pay the individual price, as you can see, $69, $89, or what most people end up doing, they just become a pro member. They get access to everything, all 22 plus courses, 130 hours of content, and more. So the best route for you is to just become a pro and get access to everything. All right. So That's it. Check out azamsharp.school and I'm sure you're going to love it. Now let's go back to the video. Right, so now that you have learned how to create middleware, let's go ahead and see that how we can perform an asynchronous action, and inside that particular asynchronous action, we're going to dispatch an event. All right, and we're going to take a very simple example of performing the increment action, but asynchronously, meaning after a couple of seconds. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and add another action. And I will call this increment async or action async. And it will be using the async protocol since this is also an action. So our plan is that we are going to perform increment, but after 2 seconds. So how can we do that? For this, we're going to go ahead and create a middleware. So let's go ahead and create a middleware. I'm going to go ahead and add a new file. A Swift file is fine. And I will call the name of the file will be increment middleware. Create. Okay. Now we have already learned that middleware is simply a function that is going to give you access to the dispatch. So I can go ahead and increment or implement the increment middleware. This is going to return you a middleware which is of type or which contains a state. And our global state is known as app state, so I'm returning the app state. Just like the log middleware, we have to make sure that we are returning something that comprises of the state, the action, and the dispatch. So let's go ahead and return something. Something that can return 3 values. I'm going to return state, action, and dispatch. Now inside over here in the increment middleware, we can perform a check because we only want to dispatch an action if the action or dispatch to the reducer if the action was increment action async. So this means that we can perform a switch on action case as increment action async, and if the increment action async happens, then we can perform an asynchronous request over here. Now right now I don't want to go into performing an actual HTTP request, but we can fake out async. So we can simply say dispatch queue.main.async after. So this means that we are going to perform this particular function after async after a certain deadline, which means whatever the current time is plus 2 more seconds. So whatever I'm about to type over here, this is going to be fired after 2 seconds. Now in your actual application, obviously you're going to be fetching from a web service and you're going to get the result, which will be after a couple of milliseconds. Over here, we are faking it out. We're simply saying that, okay, we are dispatching an action and that action is going to dispatch after 2 seconds. When it does a dispatch, we can go ahead. We already have access to the dispatch. We can simply dispatch an action. So after 2 seconds, it's going to dispatch increment action. Now we do have to also make sure that we are covering the default case, which in this case is simply break. There we go. So this is it. This is our increment middleware. We still have to make sure that we are using this middleware. So we have to inject the middleware at the correct location. If you go ahead and jump into Hello Redux app, you will find out that currently we are only using one middleware, which is the log middleware. So we can go ahead and also add another middleware, increment middleware. Keeping in mind that log middleware is always fired because it doesn't really have any checks for a particular action, but the increment middleware is only fired when the action is increment action async. As you can see over here, we're only firing it on a certain cases. All right, so this is great. Now we can actually go back to our content view and we can try to implement. Let's actually just go ahead and implement it right here. So what we're going to do is we're trying to implement another action that is going to perform the async request. All right. So let's go ahead and make some changes. First of all, I'm going to go over here to the props, and just like we have the on increment, on decrement, on add, I'm just going to go ahead and add another one, which will be on increment async. And this is going to return nothing, so void. For the map, I'm going to go ahead and map it correctly. So I'm just going to say on increment async. And the value over here will be store.dispatch. And we are going to dispatch an action, which is increment action async. Now we can go over here and find out or create another control. Right over here, we can say increment async. Let's go ahead and type it again. And we will call props.increment or on increment async. All right, here we go. Let's go ahead and build it. Okay, great. So we are able to add all of this stuff. And when we perform on increment, it is going to go ahead and dispatch increment action async. This means it is going to go all the way to the store. It's going to try to dispatch it over here, but then it's not going to really find it. So it's going to go over here to the middleware. It's going to go through all the middleware that we have registered. And you can see right over here that we have registered log middleware and we have registered the increment middleware. Two middlewares we have registered. The log middleware is going to fire every single time, but for the increment middleware, if the action is increment action async, then it is going to perform the dispatch. So all of this is going to happen because we have middleware. All right. Now, one thing that we would like to do is we would like to also print out whenever we are updating something. So let's see that where we can actually print it out. So we know that the action is getting dispatched, and after 2 seconds, we are updating the counter. I'm going to go ahead and jump into my counter reducer. And inside the counter reducer, just before returning, just going to go ahead and print out the state. There we go. And that's it. Let's go ahead and run our application. And we will see that if after 2 seconds, we are able to get a particular state or update the particular state. I'm just going to go ahead and set this to iPhone 11. And let's go ahead and run this. All right, so this is it. It's loaded. Now I'm going to go ahead and press the increment async. And if you go over here and check out the console, it's going to give you the state. And you can see that state is actually updated. It is saying 1. If I say increment action, it's saying 1, and then it's now 2. So we are able to dispatch an action after 2 seconds or after the asynchronous event has occurred. And inside over there, we were able to dispatch an action using the middleware, which is pretty cool because this means that we can go ahead and perform an asynchronous request, get the data back, and then dispatch an action which can take the data and store it in the global state. So now that you have learned about creating middleware and how to dispatch an async action, in the next lectures, we'll be building up a real application using a real API. So let's go ahead and get started.